Hello everyone, today we read and comment on the 28th paragraph of the second chapter of the second book of von Clausewitz, Vom Kriege. The title being, "By this point of view, theory becomes possible and ceases to be in contradiction to practice." The text follows. Taking this point of view, there is a possibility afforded of a satisfactory, that is, of a useful theory of the conduct of war, never coming into opposition with the reality, and it will only depend on rational treatment to bring it so far into harmony with action that between theory and practice there shall no longer be that absurd difference which an unreasonable theory, in defiance of common sense, has often produced, but which, just as often, narrow-mindedness and ignorance have used as a pretext for giving way to their natural incapacity. So this paragraph is essentially a statement come after the realization that there can be effectively a ground on which to found a theory of the art of war, not a positive one, but still one that is satisfactory, that is useful, as von Clausewitz puts in here. And yet, von Clausewitz adds in here also very interesting considerations about the flaws and limits of certain theories, not just of those who want to, express like the positivity of the theory as such, but fundamentally, of people who don't look much beyond into this extremely complex situation that war is, right, and thinking that it suffices simply to get everything, to interpret everything, let's say, better through just single notions that should be applicable in every situation, right, and which is most evidently not the case. So by the title we can immediately say, by this point of view, theory becomes possible, right? We have seen in the previous paragraph that we can identify a set of a base, let's say, that in fact is not even distinguishable as a set of individual elements, like even if it's composed by it, but this thing floats, right? And it's as if in fact you had this sum of this substance you can't see, you can't touch, but you effectively don't know what it is, or at least you're not able to read it through so easily at the point you can tear it down, but you already know, you just know that is there, and over the substance floats essentially all what you have to take into consideration when taking action, right? Obviously concentrating on this let's say, if not epiphenomenal, at least most evident and different and singular and specific situation that occurs in time, but always realizing that there is a base on which this fundamentally moves, right? And this base can be shifted. It's as if it was a liquid, right? That you you can, let's say, move, agitate, but it's always there at the end of the day, and you can't ignore it, and it helps to support of what you're doing here. And this is why, and this substance is the base for a theory proper, and in fact this theory, thanks to it, ceases to be in contradiction to practice at the point you can basically always rely on it, right? Relying, which doesn't mean that it solves problems for you. You always have to be committed to solve this, let's say, if not solving the equation, which is impossible, at least to try to understand certain variables of it that can be of useful practice for you in that specific moment, and then going on as well as you can, right? And this is, as we often say, this is not the recipe for winning in every situation, which is impossible, right? Because you can't do that. It's as if excuse me, you were always depending on a risk, right, and on a very high one, right, that naturally in absolute terms can vary if the thing is not extremely, like, it's obvious that there are wars that are kind of easy to win in inside, but still within the statistical possibilities, these things, that the outcome varies wildly at a point that it depends naturally on several factors. First and chiefly on the political will and and objective, and secondly, of course, also on this infinite set of possibilities can present during the waging of war properly meant. Excuse me once again. And this is the ground, however, that helps you realize it. Like these foundations von Clausewitz has evidenced are those which do not solve for you the problem, but make you realize that you're still into a world of concreteness, like that you can't speculate fundamentally on what happens, but realizing that even if you can't understand it fully, and not even by the majority, you can still, that is still real, and in this reality there are dynamics that usually occur in a certain way. The variables are kind of all messed up. You don't know the values of most elements. Actually, you don't know most elements proper in the system, but you still know that tendentially certain elements are in connection with others in a certain way, right? In a certain function that, of course, depending on the variables, can vary wildly, and this is connected in turn to other variables, and that's why you can't calculate it, right? And there is no calculator that can sort these things out. But that contingently gives you kind of an awareness about what is going on that you can maybe exploit in a certain direction. This is all what theory does, right? You can use it as a manual, but not in the sense of a manual of instructions that tells you what to do at every single step, but because by that point you're reading the enemy has already taken the initiative, and we'll see how detrimental that is eventually. But it's as if it was something in the back of your mind you can always rely and revert to when you're in front of a problem, and there is naturally talent and genius and an experience, right, that helps dramatically in this that help you make the good choice, right? Maybe not the best choice, but at least something that is sensitive, that maybe will make you lose anyway, but that at least was better than nothing, and maybe saved more resources for another day. All right. So there are things you can't oppose. First and foremost, understanding what is going on in essential lines, right? It's difficult. I mean, you can understand it in essential lines, and this is what von Clausewitz is heading to, in the sense that there are essential lines, right? But there are, however, very tricky and difficult to sort out, right? And most of the times, they're not going to be known even after the engagement is over, and after you kind of know more than before about it, so that you can start reasoning more coldly about it, because in that moment you were under pressure, and it was extremely difficult to cope with that, psychologically speaking. But the whole point is kind of even more poignant, let's say, when you understand that your mind has a capacity of making a synthesis of all these factors in a way that no calculator can. We really don't know how we do certain things, but our brain is capable of reacting by itself, aside from reasons, in ways that help you frame information and knowledge, and that are ultimately useful for you taking action rationally. That is to say that there are certain capabilities, certain abilities of your mind that enable you to not just to get information, but to already frame it in a way automatically, without needing for you to calculate that rationally, that eventually will serve for a rational calculation. And so this all works more fluidly than it seems, and that's why also the need for a complicated theory that pretends to explain everything is silly, because it's machinos, right? The same Von Clausewitz says, theoretically, if we could sort everything out in terms of reason, of science, we would, and we should do that. Theoretically, the most important thing in war is to be intelligent, even than being courageous, telling the truth. You can't have, let's say, one without the other, but intelligence comes first, and normally the more intelligent wins, not the strongest. But at the same time, if we were to calculate this, we wouldn't simply have time to cope with reality, right? And that's how we live. We don't calculate every single thing when we have to drive a car, a motorcycle, calculating all the wind, the other stuff that happens around. We just have a synthesis of ability, which seems crazy, right? And just think about, would you trust if you were to enter into a car that is driven by a software, right? Now, this stuff is developing, right, and there are good results, but still there are problems about it. But what would you trust? Would you trust the car, or would you trust yourself? We instinctively trust ourselves. I mean, getting on a motorcycle, if you think about it, it's something crazy, right? Every time I do it, I say, what the hell? In half an hour, I could be like with a broken spine in hospital, not being able to walk again. If I'm unlucky, if I'm lucky, I could even be dead, right? And yet I start, and I don't mind about it, and I intrinsically rely on this great computer that is my brain, and we all do that. At the point that, of course, there are human errors. There is we know, statistically speaking, that we fail, but as important as that can be for us, still, statistically speaking, it's a miracle that we are able, as living beings, to achieve what we are able to achieve with our mind. So a positive theory that pretends to investigate everything and to be applicable in every single circumstance is also an insult to human intelligence, because it starts from the fact that what humans have done, historically speaking, just like fighting wars in this case, something that needed a guy from today that tells you how it should have been fought, right? This is probably, if you go around the internet, maybe you think that I'm that kind of guy that tells you how to pretends to explain you, I don't know, military history, stuff like that. But you surely know someone who does that in a way that it's kind of unbearable, like that pretends to reduce everything to simple factors, that gives you, elementary, when not idiotic, explanations about extremely complex things, and that pretends to be right. That is an insult to the dignity of human intelligence, and is mostly a failure of reason at that point, because, we do develop reason artificially, right? We are in terms of hardware, we are capable of doing that, but in order to be more intelligent, we have to be educated. That's why we educate people. That's why we go to school. You're not born intelligent and remain at the same level of intelligence if you don't improve it in some way, right? So those people kind of prove the fact that they know a few, if anything, right? And not just that, and not that they are kind of more intelligent because they give kind of concise explanations. Obviously, it depends also on the modes, on what the topic is, but the point here is that someone who pretends that something is always in a certain way, must be cut sharply, etc., is fundamentally doing the same thing that those positive theorists that von Clausewitz criticizes are doing. And they do it, in fact, for a lack of reason. Because our reason, even in terms of sheer rationality and scientific understanding, does bring us in front of these limits. I mean, every scientist will tell you that, objectively, we do have limits of understanding. This is not a problem of saying whether, I don't know, classical physics is real or not in absolute and therefore metaphysically speaking. This is a matter of saying, you may even have the physical, knowledge of a physical law, but you may not have the means to test certain things because they are beyond our reach, not just mentally, but also, I don't know, more banally because of lack of money or resources. And that's a problem, right? And that makes you crush against those limits, right? And that's when, that's the difference between dogmatism and actual intelligence, because dogmatism remains focused on this thing is in this way, point, end of the story. No, it cannot work that way unless you're particularly sure about it and you can provide evidence for what you're saying, which is difficult. It's easy to be peremptory and apodictic and to dismiss things easily, but that's exactly when you try to understand that you realize you need maybe to know more, to formulate your phrases better, to be also a bit more vague in certain circumstances, and in any case to be also humble about this all. So the amazing thing that von Clausewitz shows us here is that if you shift the your understanding from the presumption of the possibility of the construction, let's say, of a positive theory of the art of war, to something more concretely based on experience that kind of builds itself empirically in part, because even military history proper has a huge importance in it, in experience of military facts in general, well, then you can have something that ceases, as he says here, to be in contradiction to practice. That's probably the single most important thing of all here. Always remember that von Clausewitz here writes exclusively to determine things that can be of practical use. Not things that are like a speculation, let's say if, and then, presenting a set of conditions that in practice are not just, maybe they're not completely impossible in mathematical terms, but that are radically different from basically everything we have ever seen in reality, right? That can't be an answer. As it can't be an answer to pretend to solve a complex system like reality, and by taking out huge portions of it, of all the things that can happen, basically, to simplify that. Like, in fact, the principle of internal lines does, right? By saying that, okay, it's just about maps and places on a map, and there is no, I don't know, moral elements involved, right? Where's the moral element? Of course, Jomini's theory is more complex than that, but essentially it gets to it gets down to a geometrical principle, whereas for von Clausewitz, as we've seen, war is essentially a clash between moral forces, and he's pretty damn right about it. That's what you have to enter in. You have to be aware of, right? This is not a clash between different opinions on a matter. This is not between blue pill and red pill, right? It's not or either black or white, and this is really about testing something that works and that you can verify, especially, right? So it's very actually, it's actually very simple to determine that. I mean, it's simple in the measure in which you take a lot of evidence and you put it together, and you start not pretending to frame it all into a enormous system that is eventually flawed, because your mind can't even encompass more than a few, like how much can you learn by heart object. So you can imagine what a complex system is. But by doing what we actually already do, cognitively, intellectually speaking, that is to make a synthesis of the things that appear to be more important because they have kind of a more evident effect on reality. Like, the thing is very complicated in the sense that sometimes, and everybody would debate about military historical matters knows, the situation is fairly more complicated than that. But also, who studies military matters knows that you can solve this by knowing other stuff about military logic, essentially, that can help you frame what you see, not into your own system of opinions, but into what other things from that set of events have showed you before, right? So it's like having a maximum common denomination at the base, like a shared base from which eventually reality departs in the measure in which every situation is different from another in every single case, but that still is like 80% corresponding to to reality as we have seen it. Like 80% now is completely random, but it's just to say that there is an overwhelming point in common, right, that we tend to forget. This is something I say every time I speak here, not just about the history of war, but also of other stuff, about politics and society. When we talk about videos about the Middle Ages, we tend to say, okay, let's concentrate on the fact, I don't know, that these were countries that more or less overlap with the ones that exist today, and let's start to stereotype them in a certain way because it's easier to understand. But it's actually way more realistic, historically speaking, of noticing, first of all, what was in common to them, because it was overwhelming compared to the differences, right? How do you think pre-industrial societies differed? Right? In of course, they could differ enormously from centralized states with professional armies, bureaucracy, to hunters gatherers. But still, in the essentials, there are certain bases in terms of production and energy, etc., that you can kind of identify together. It goes by approximation, but nevertheless, it's very, very effective, right? So, however, this is the most important point. Like, it's obvious that we instinctively, just like I've done myself now, we tend to find kind of more correct measures of defining certain things. But you have to realize, at one point, you can't understand everything. You have to stop and even if there is obviously always room for knowing more, and who studies history knows perfectly what I'm talking about, but still, you have to draw your conclusions and say, okay, but what is it concretely we are seeing here? You have to have this capacity of synthesis that looks at the essentials, and our mind already helps us dramatically in doing this, because it's what even just a few amount of reason we can objectively do compared to various situations. And what we tend, we sometimes forget, or at least we don't do on purpose, because we're kind of lazy-minded, and therefore we prefer kind of stupid dichotomies to actual investigation of reality is something more complex if one just goes beyond cliches and approximation and banalities. In fact, this paragraph of von Clausewitz is an attack to what he writes here about narrow-mindedness and ignorance, right? These are the terms he uses, because it's literally what it is, right? It's a problem of making you frame more information in kind of a orderly but concise form that essentially derives from the fact that you haven't been acquainted to more information at once that obliged you to make this effort to try to frame them in a more realistic and complicated picture, a complex picture, let's say, at least, and also complicated, yes, of course. So, and the amazing thing I would add is that, intellectually speaking, we are, once you get to acquainted to a certain level of complexity, you rarely go back. At least, of course it can happen, but let's say once you have known the complexity of something, very rarely you are going to doubt that it can be like that, even on other occasions, right? And it's as if you went by stages, right? That's why we need I don't know, why courses, studies are kind of structured hierarchically, because objectively they do correspond to different types of different types of advancements that require you an ever greater critical skill. That is what make you progress effectively. That's why also a lot of information is not necessarily just the only element you need. You also need kind of pressure and interest in framing all this knowledge into something more concise, right? And in order to do that, you have to understand that knowledge. There is an enormous difference between this. I can't tell you now. As you know, I'm working at a chapter that is going to be excruciatingly long. It's all about battles. It's actually like 12 or 13 battles that I'm reconstructing, and I have to analyze, which are, let's say, incredibly, they're actually very interesting, first of all, and they're not so excessively complex, but, some of them had tens of sources, so it's not particularly easy to frame them all. And the interesting thing is that I've read all these sources for the last 2 years, but only now that I'm coming to make a synthesis about these battles and understanding those details better in insight, that I'm realizing certain things that objectively before I had not known, even if I had been exposed to that information continuously. So this is the exact proof that there is an improvement, that you need to take different steps in order to to get somewhere. Otherwise you can read and read and read and read, but up to the point you're not required to write something about it, to make your brain working on it in a certain critical way, you remain at that stage of intelligence, and there is not much you can do. That's why there is a huge difference between reading and studying, right? And this is not about having a title or not. This is a matter of really, reading and studying. There are two different things, right? And learning maybe is also different, meaning that of course there are people who study certain things but they don't quite get there. But that, I would say, learning comes natural as long as you study properly, in the sense that you're not lazy, you're not doing it just for doing it, but you have a motive, a reason, and you're doing it kind of decently. So von Clausewitz writes, taking this point of view, there is a possibility afforded of a satisfactory, that is, of a useful theory in the conduct of war. Right, so we have already seen it, that we can start from this premises to build not a, omniscient, but just a satisfactory theory on the conduct of war, the theory of the art of war, that is useful, that you can put to use, right? And then he writes, never coming into opposition with the reality, and it will only depend on rational treatment to bring it so far into harmony with action that between theory and practice there shall no longer be that absurd difference which an unreasonable theory, in defiance of common sense, has often produced, but which, just as often, narrow-mindedness and ignorance have used as a pretext for giving way to their natural incapacity. So, this is a long sentence. Actually, it's only one sentence. I realize it now. Just you see that. I've read the stuff. I hadn't even realized that it was a single phrase. Now, just because I was trying to sort that out, I realized that it was, right? So now I have to adapt to it in a certain way. While I was reading, I don't know, I felt an emotion like, thinking about this person and the fact that he had seen reality in here, right? The first prejudice that I think we have towards thinkers is, what the hell is this guy saying, right? I disagree with him. I want to be his enemy because I must know better. Like, I fear his knowledge. I fear what he's saying now. He's just a pompous bastard, a bombastic idiot that wants to... And you have to think this person stayed at war for decades, in the heat of battle, and he's concerned about what? About a theory. It does not come into opposition with the reality. Now, you could say, well, thanks my eyes, I also want the theory that is never into opposition with the reality. What were those guys with positive theory of art of war doing? Well, yeah, they were exactly searching for that. We were searching for that in the wrong way. That is constantly, in fact, in opposition with the reality. And this doesn't minimally, take away the problem of determining what the reality is. This is the greatness of von Clausewitz, is that he recognizes in a surrounded by a positivistic environment, let's say, that achievement cannot be reached. Like, the problems we have to understand reality are always there. There's not a manual that can solve them for us, right? And this is probably one of the most mature realizations that a person can have. And this person was under gunfire, like cannon fire. So people dying in front of him. We have talked about that paragraph in which he describes what it is to approach a battlefield and what you feel like, right? And if you find yourself in that situation, you understand even more why he's so concerned about this. That there is a paradox here. That is, war is the moment in which you're most, you reason less less coldly, right? Your mind is spinning, and in theory, actually, it works very fast to sort out what really matters. But until you're not in that situation, you don't understand how difficult that is, right? And on the assessments about what is going on depends your own life. So you can see here why he's so concerned about that, because he experienced that in person. And he experienced that even when he was a general. Always remember this fact: the higher up you go in the hierarchy, and the more responsibility augments, right? So it's not just about your own life, right? Sometimes you can be crushed even by killing other people, not by dying yourself. And it can be terrible, because at least that person maybe has stopped suffering. You haven't. Maybe you will be destroyed for a lifetime. How many generals took their own lives because they couldn't bear the fact they had killed thousands of people? Feel about what Churchill felt like after Gallipoli, for example. We know about his depression, about his sufferings. We know how tough that is, right? And we know. Actually, we don't know up to the point in which we are responsible for that. And the other amazing thing about this is that we don't need so much of a rational thinking about it. We immediately feel it, right? Especially, I think, people who are used to reason very theoretically tend to give for granted the fact that when they're brought into a real thing, they immediately start to feel, right, that coldness that they importantly have in order to think things right, kind of objectively, think things through objectively, is melted away when you're in a situation that, albeit banal, is so dramatic. Like when a person is dying, when there is an emergency, when also the responsibility is on you to do something about that. It all changes. It's as if we were put in motion by that. And we all know that. We all know that because we all find ourselves sooner or later in such circumstances in which we have to react to problems that sometimes are unsolvable. Well, war is more or less like this. Especially when you don't know what the hell is going on constantly. And that's why, rightfully, von Clausewitz defines war as probably the field of human actions in which the thing is, let's say, the outcome is the most difficult to predict. Actually, he has no doubts about it. He's pretty sure. And you can imagine at that point that with thousands of lives at stake, what it means to feel like that, and how difficult it can be to act upon this, right? It's really tearing. So, of course, von Clausewitz is aware what he's saying when he says you should find a theory that is never in opposition with the reality, right? Which is not, obviously, a blind faith in the fact that this can happen. It's not even a real faith in it, because he's the first one that explained us why reality is very often unintelligible for us. But that's exactly why we should pose ourselves the problem to tend towards the right direction. And reality is an astonishing guide in this. That's what he's really telling us, that in spite of all the difficulties, all we have to deal with is objective reality. And objective reality, as far as we are concerned, is real, right? It's not necessarily the truth, but we do interact with reality that is, a pretty, sound element that defines overall the truth that beyond that we can't reach, of course. But it's all very important to know that at least you have to orient yourself right. And that's why there are things that are kind of good and bad in inside, because even if it's practically impossible to distinguish sharply between the two, we know that certain directions are objectively wrong, right? When we see someone that is going towards a completely different direction from the one that we know functions, because we are making it function in that way, well, that's a very empirical way to say, okay, this is kind of at least the better way, and probably, how it should be done. Maybe it could be improved, of course, and there are many limits, and it's a kind of a problem to make everything work properly, but still, it is how it should be done, right? You can encounter this when you study military history. That's when you know a lot of things. You start studying things about it. You start reflecting on why, and trying to answer questions, because I presume this is mostly about being curious, right? This is not just like for everything we learn because we want to know for some reason. And when you do this, a lot of times you kind of acquire a sort of what we call, at least in this field of military logic specifically, as there are things that make sense, there are others that don't, and it's dramatically easy, by the way, and that's why I should make a video about Facebook groups to observe this stuff, how it happens around. Like, go on every, maybe not my videos because they, too few people watch them, but go into successful channels, or even going to Facebook groups. That is even more interesting, because there is a bit more of not much of collective action, but of individual action that can put in evidence people's single minds and how they reason, and is a bit more selective, and see what a regular debate about these issues, as could be others, but specifically about war, since we're talking about war, really develop like. And is an astonishing school, right? The cool thing about this stuff now is that we don't have to be necessarily involved. We can't just stay there in front of a screen eating popcorns, right? And like in the meme, and observing and learning from it. And obviously, I think the funniest part, maybe not the funniest, but the most productive, is putting yourself under the same pressure by participating to discussion. And believe me, it's very, very difficult. It also develops, it's not just a matter of knowledge or competence, it's also a matter of human intelligence, of human empathy, realizing what is that the others are following you for, what you're discussing. And it helps. It helps a lot. There can't be a real understanding of these things without a like a debate with others. I don't think it's possible, right? And that's why there is so much hatred, even sometimes so much competition, because it's a bit, let's say, it has a lot of complications in it that people need to solve, apparently unexpectedly, right? And that's like a fight. There are certain philosophies of language that state that language is objectively a fight. Like just right now, I'm making a quest, like I'm making a point that I'm kind of defending and explaining to you, and I intrinsically feel like the aggressiveness that I have for making you listen to this and pretending, not pretending, but hoping at least that you could agree with me, right? Obviously, I don't do it for clashing with you or for having a, this backfire. But it's obvious that if I started to say extremely stupid things, or maybe I do all the time, who knows, I would receive a lot of criticism at the point it would be unbearable in certain measure that would oblige me in turn, though, to find a solution, because I can't just be passive to this. I should respond in a certain way. So is there is a lot of implications here. There is a lot of this is not just about history. This is really about politics and society. That's why von Clausewitz was so right also about his trinity, because these three things are always intertwined. The enmity and hostile feeling and conflict is inherent in human relations. It can't be erased. It can't be pretended to be non-existent, right? So it's really tough sometimes to progress in this field, and it seems as if at one point we were disappointed about something, but that's the moment in which you have learned something that hopefully you will put to good use, right? And that's the concreteness that von Clausewitz teaches you. And most of the times that concreteness comes exactly from the fact that you were reasoning in abstract terms, and that you were confronted with reality by a certain degree that made you think otherwise, right? And that's also why it's kind of difficult to, because it's obvious that speculations are also part of our development. Like, we couldn't make military history without hypothesis, right? Von Clausewitz says theoretically, every historian should always say things only if there is a real cause and effect relation. But he was a military historian himself, and he perfectly knew that, there were certain things that we kind of don't really know about, right? Even at the time, historiography was the one that it was. Von Clausewitz was writing at a time in which, the most modern military historiography in the West was still very, very primitive. Was essentially just rising. Albeit it would kind of develop mostly from the second half of the 19th century. So he was also limited in part. He talked about, the Napoleonic Wars in ways that, he participated to them. He knew perfectly well certain things that we will never know. But at the same time, there is a greater understanding that derives essentially from this very patient construction that we can make of certain realities, like that we observe and that we try to interpret. So then what he says here will only depend on rational treatment to bring it so far into harmony with action that between theory and practice there shall no longer be that absolute difference which an unreasonable theory will... Okay, so here it is important to stress the reasonable aspect of the story. Like, being reasonable doesn't just mean like being let's say, it means obviously to be fully scientific, because that would solve all the problems objectively, but it also means to be reasonable sometimes in the logical sense. Like, there are things you can't push too much, even if you're convinced maybe of their validity. You should also consider what other people have written. You should always consider other perspectives, because otherwise you would be isolated a bit in your ivory tower, and that's exactly what would bring from that detachment from reality. That's why also debate and a confrontation with others is necessary in this case. So, but there is an aim in here, is that there should be an harmony between reality and this rationality. Right? There should be a moment in which you must be able to stop defending certain ideas you formerly had, to say, okay, these were kind of simple, and I can improve that because reality is more complex, and I can understand more and better, right? And there is this aspect that actually, oh yes, of course, here from Clausewitz uses, in defiance of common sense, like there must be common sense. Common sense is a complement to rationality, right? It's a form, it's behavioral, it has to do with how agreeable, how, but also how open you are to, and how intelligent you are in a different form, right? At the point of saying, okay, I can't exactly fight against the entire world, right? There must be something about myself that I have to check as well. We don't have the solution, the easy solution for everything, right? When I read these things, I think at all the things I could say that would be useful as personal examples of personal experience, to say that can show you, why you are wrong, or why you can be wrong all the time, theoretically as well. And it always happens, and it's probably exactly in the moment in which you're too sure about something that you can immediately guess, and you would do it right, for sure, that in turn, that you are at least a bit wrong, like that there is something that you have overlooked, that you have presumed, right? Because most of problems derive from presumption. They derive from, in fact, how the etymology is sumere, right? That means to first to extract before, right? And without understanding it, right? And there is a limit to this. It's obvious that we constantly do that, and we couldn't do otherwise. But there is also a way to train yourself to do better. This is probably one of the most important part of the stories. That's why we study. That's why we keep learning, because you don't arrive to one point and say, okay, now I'm done. Never think that a historian can be like, I studied 3 years of history at university, or 5 years of history at university, or 8 years with a PhD. No, if you stop being a researcher. You stop being a historian. It's a problem. Like it's difficult to talk about this in these terms. There is not an acquired let's say endless competence only because you got a degree. Right, it doesn't work like that. Especially in history, this is so evident because history is potentially infinite. Right, history is larger than basically any other discipline we know, because it contains in it basically every other one. You could study everything in history, including, I don't know, history of science, the history of economics, everything. So you could theoretically, as a historian, learn everything, but obviously you can't. Because you're just a human being. But just for saying that, if you stop doing what you do as a historian, well, yeah, of course, you might have acquired some knowledge about something during your studies, but it ends there, right? Instead, history is something you should improve. Like the best historians are those who believe like that, and it's not easy. Like, because I don't know how historians earn abroad. I don't think much. But there is this stereotype that knowledge is kind of not good, it doesn't help more than much. Well, that's because many people give up, and they don't say much, and they remain confined in their own specialistic fields, or they at least, which are totally respectable, and they help contribute. But let's say that they they don't totalize this experience, right? To me, history, for example, is everything in the sense, of course, to me, I don't know, affections or family and health meant as just maybe physical training or something come first. But for example, history to me comes first than my job, even though I kind of work like with history. So to me, it's something that goes beyond. It's like an existential reason to go on, and it can't end. Like I couldn't conceive to stop at one point reading or studying. It's gonna be a problem, right? It's a problem for many people that would like to keep on studying and they can't because maybe they don't have enough money to go on. They need to do something else. But if you study something just to say, okay, I stop one day because that's enough, you kind of betray what a true historian really is, right? Because you simply stop being one at that point, because you don't study anymore, you don't research anymore. Hence, you're not a historian by definition. Historian, that's what it really means. So, I don't want to be tragic or preachy as usual, but I feel that we maybe should start considering even how important history objectively is for fluidifying society, for helping it growing, for having a real impact on the mind of people. I've never openly talked about these things in a dedicated video because I have that Easter Rain, in fact, playlist in which I express myself regarding kind of I mean, not really personal stuff, but things that that are fundamentally my opinions as my personal experience as I think it is. But we should try to go beyond. I wouldn't like Schwerpunkt to be just a storytelling channel, right? I don't think it would be fair, even for people who listen, to just tell you about stories and then don't telling you what's behind them. Because on YouTube now everything is based on entertainment. At the point videos have just to be entertaining, which means you have to keep the person glued like those 5 minutes on the screen, and then they're done with. Well, that requires a very poor amount of skill and of criticism, so it doesn't actually help to grow. If you listen to someone expressing an opinion, it doesn't matter if it's not great opinion, like maybe presumably my one is not, my one is in fact. I don't think I say exceptional things or that I express myself in such interesting ways, but I think it still gives more than just the story, because history is part of life in itself. It's making all of these videos for me is not just trying to make you know more about the past as such, but it's making you understand how difficult it is to understand reality, which is valid for everybody, aside from, independently from on what you do, whether this stuff is going to be useful in your life or not as historical topics, because there is a lesson you can learn from it, from the mere action of bothering yourself to know these things. So I don't know, maybe I will talk about this at one point more thoroughly, but I think it's still meaningful and we can expand on it further. And von Clausewitz concludes, in fact, that this push for simplifications is essentially a way narrow-mindedness and ignorance often have used as a pretext for giving way to their natural incapacity. Now, this is very important as a statement because it kind of sounds like, this guy probably thinks everybody's stupid. Actually not. This is a problem that evidently he tested on himself and on any other person, and we can't do it the very same thing. Meaning that, one is that we produce ideas that are against common sense. Right. I don't know, maybe there is someone who criticizes common sense as such. I mean, objectively, there is sometimes I mean, common sense, depending on what you really mean, which part of it you want to stress, on the common or on the sense, meaning what does common mean? That other people believe the same thing, hence you should think the same, or it's more about the sense that things make sense, but the whole expression is obviously something deeper in our understanding, in our culture. Common sense to us is being reasonable, even if with a sort of, in fact, of sensitivity that you have in parallel with reason, I would say. And that is a proof of your reasons, because, in fact, one thing that history teaches you to do is to be able to frame information, even when you don't know it. Like, history and our minds in general make us do this. Like, experience tells us that even if we don't know something, we can have the tools to embrace it, right? It's not that if we don't understand something, it doesn't enter into our brain. But we constantly learn, essentially, and we constantly learn from this learning to frame other information is more complex and complicated. So common sense is a sixth sense in a certain way that helps us framing unknown stuff. And our, in fact, open-mindedness and knowledge, that is the opposite here of what von Clausewitz writes as narrow-mindedness and ignorance, is based exactly on this. I mean, on the capacity of what does open-minded means? Well, being open-minded simply means to be capable of framing every kind of information, which is a terrible power, is a terrific power in itself. Like, is having an enormous edge on someone who is exposed to that same knowledge. It can't make it getting in his mind, because it's too narrow mind, right? So you are, the more open-minded you are, and the more disadvantage fuels itself, which is extraordinary. It is extraordinary. And the same goes in parallel with ignorance/knowledge. Like, the more you learn, the more you know. And that helps in turn. So, what von Clausewitz is telling us is that having a positivistic approach to reality is a natural way for narrow-mindedness and ignorance to be satisfied with themselves, right? It's like, when von Clausewitz started to list at the beginning of this chapter how the theory of the art of war has started, like, historically. The first thing he said, this guys saw at war, look at war and saw that it was kind of too complicated, and therefore the first thing they did was to take out all the most difficult stuff by admission, basically, and to start from material objects, right, from the material dimension. And that's objectively the instinctive reason to do that, right? And that's why narrow-minded and ignorant people tend to stick to that base, right, to things that are kind of very material, right? They don't understand, because even material has a value that you can frame only if you go beyond that matter. That's free market, that's classic economy, right? Objects do not have an intrinsic wealth in themselves. It has nothing to do on how they are built or produced. They have to do with who's willing to buy them. So that's essentially what the Clausewitzian theory is doing here. Is showing you that pretending that there is a best way to always, to make war that can help you to win in all times, is basically attributing an absolute value to something that varies by definition, and that requires, as a consequence, you to constantly reshape your mind in order to fix it, to find a solution. And that requires, indeed, a lot of open-mindedness and knowledge. That's why this whole thing is being written, right? Here we arrived, we're still kind of far from the myth of the Vom Kriege, but we have done 1/3, more almost, and it's evident that this first third of the work is basically dedicated to this, right? This is where von Clausewitz has led us throughout all these pages, because objectively, this is perhaps the single most important thing to understand, without which we can't understand all the rest. In fact, the real problem, going back to those debates you can spy on Facebook and all, the first thing you see is not people are not acquainted to actual stories, etc., but they can't frame them. They can't understand them. They can't repeat them. Can telling like stories, but they fundamentally don't understand what they are about. And that's why, actually, and it's a very easy. Okay, I decided that I will make a video in which I will look at maybe some random conversation. I will try to do it in kind of in anonymous, right? But I think it's extremely instructive, because you can learn a lot from that too yourself. It's not just a way to mock someone, which I'm not interested in, but it's really showing you what are the mistakes that people do so that you can avoid doing them in turn. And we all have to learn in some way. Here I know, as you know, I never pose myself. I'm not speaking ex cathedra, let's say, ever. I'm just having a somewhat, hopefully, lovely chat with you. But we all have to learn something from this. I mean, we all make mistakes. We all can better ourselves in this regard. And there is no other hope, I would say, for a sensible person to think himself or herself like. I count on this. I think great part of the reason why I make these videos every day is exactly to point this out, to make people reason a bit more. Because what I've noticed is that we all fall in this. Like, at a certain level, we all have this limit, first of all. But secondly, this limit, sometimes it's so very low that, from one side you usually find people that seem to know everything, like they have sorted out all of their system and they trying to make it work. From the other one, you have people who try to make you just doubt, but never getting to a point, right? And there is a middle ground in which instead the thing should evolve by itself. And I realized there are two different philosophies. I just recently started to think at the matter in these terms, but I think it's interesting, even sociologically speaking, to see why there are certain groups of people that do that, and others that do this, right? And why they, where's the middle ground? Why they're separated, or what this brings to for society? Because these are all stuff we could put to great use. And I'm personally not into sociology. I'm not into psychology. I mean, I like them in theory, right? But I don't read about them. And I don't know how far they've gone. But something that amazes me is the means that we have today, for example, on the internet to study these behaviors. Like even a site like YouTube, for example. Like, it has these enormous statistics. From here, I can't see everything that happens already with my fans. I'm fans, my followers, my viewers. This is the various hierarchy of the groups that gets from the narrowest to the larger. And I can't see what this dynamics work like, and there is a lot to learn from them. Really, a lot to learn from them. And you start understanding things that are actually quite realistic, because even if you can't be sure about what there is in a single person's mind, but you can start see here how the thing evolves, and it wakes you up a little bit, right? And well, okay, more or less I wanted to say this. I think we can stop now. Next time, what is it here? This is important. Yeah, and the other paragraphs are still going to be kind of small. and we'll have to arrive to longer ones later. But I'm glad we're progressing, and that we're especially talking about this stuff step by step, because it gives also me the side. I earn a bit of time, because these paragraphs are kind of easy to prepare, as you understand, for a video. But there are also the chance, as you understand here, to say something meaningful, right? These are not just anecdotes. They tell something concrete, and they help you understanding a lot of other things. And yeah, this is more or less what I wanted to say. And so for now, I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like, or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time. Bye.